to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, this is Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist and a teacher, and I'm your host on Raising Teens. As a parent, I know that raising a teenager can be an incredible, exhilarating, and joyous journey. It can also be confusing and really lonely at times. On this podcast, we are going to be joined by well-known experts where we chat about some of the most common questions that I get asked about raising teenagers in my own work. Our episodes are jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with, supporting, and loving your teen. Paul Dillon has been working in the area of drug education for almost 30 years. Through his own business, Data, Drug and Alcohol Research and Training Australia, he has been contracted by many organisations to provide updates on current drug trends as well as advice on alcohol and other drug issues. He's a best-selling author and he continues to work with many school communities across the country to ensure they have access to good quality information and best practice drug education. With a broad knowledge of a range of content areas, Paul is regarded as a key social commentator. He writes a blog for parents and caregivers as well as another for young people, and these have recently been released in podcast format. Hello, Paul, and welcome to Raising Teens.
Oh, thank you for having me, Collett. A great pleasure to be here.
So you are, and have been for a very long time, my go-to expert on all things alcohol or drug-related, particularly in the life of teenagers. And I was even honoured to have you contribute to my book. Paul, I don't think I've ever asked you, how did you get into this field of work?
It was completely by chance. It was certainly not something that I ever intended to do. I was a teacher for a long period of time. I started teaching in the late 70s. I had a couple of really tough years, so I left. I did a variety of different things and then just kind of fell into a job in the alcohol and the drug field. I knew nothing about alcohol and other drugs. I was probably the most naive person you could ever have got in this area. I ended up getting a job at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre. And we were getting people who were calling and schools who were asking for researchers to give talks. None of the researchers wanted to do it, surprise, surprise. And they said, look, you were a teacher, you do it. And that's how it happened. But the beauty, I suppose, of what I did was that my boss at the time said, we are a research centre. You're not going to go into schools and speak to kids without it being based on research. So what that meant was that I had to go and have a look at all the evidence in the area of drug education for young people and see what worked, what didn't. And so my program was based around that. So I'm kind of lucky. I was a teacher. I worked in alcohol and other drugs, and I also worked in the area of research. So when you put those three things together, I really was incredibly fortunate that I sort of like fell into it.
Incredible. My background is also in teaching, and I sometimes say, once a teacher, always a teacher. Those of us in teaching, hey, Paul, we can never get out of working with young people in some way or form.
You're absolutely right. I mean, my father always says that, I kind of got back to what I should have always been doing. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate. I love what I do.
So, Paul, I've chatted about drinking on the podcast before. I've quoted you a lot, and to start on an encouraging note, we do seem to see that teenagers are drinking less than their parents' generation. One of the great things, I think, is that parents seem to have a greater understanding of the teenage brain, the research on the effects of alcohol on teenage brain development. And we also know, well, this myth kind of went around that if you supplied your children with alcohol within the safety of your home, they would actually drink less or more responsibly, when actually the opposite is true. So can you chat with us a little bit about the varying views that you see in your work when it comes to alcohol and parties, but particularly in provision of alcohol to teenagers?
Well, you're absolutely right, Collett, that we are seeing an increasing number of young people, not only in Australia but around the world, who are choosing not to drink. Now, I suppose that's one of our great success stories in this area. There's great debate over why we're seeing this change. We've gone from about 1 in 10 young people who chose not to drink back in 1999 to the latest figures we have, which were 2017, 1 in 3. So it's really quite a cultural shift. In Europe, it's gone from about 1 in 10 to 1 in 5. And they say there that certainly it has to do with better parental education. Parents are more aware of the risks. But I don't think that's necessarily the case here. I think it's got a lot more to do with the value that is put onto non-drinking by young people. You're actually seen as an important part of a social group if you choose not to drink. You're the person who looks after everybody. So in the past, when a non-drinker would be very quiet about the fact that they didn't drink, maybe even pretend to drink, now you're the person who everyone wants as a friend because you're the person who looks after everybody. So I think that has shifted. And certainly in the years that I've done this, I've seen a growing number of young people who are very proud of the fact that they don't drink. So I think that's one issue. When it comes to parents in Australia, I think certainly parents are more aware of the alcohol issue than they ever have been before. I've done this for close to 30 years, and certainly a huge shift in the number of parents who come to parent nights who want to hear about alcohol. In the past, I can remember when I first started giving talks, particularly in regional parts of the country, where I'd be starting my talk and I'd start talking about alcohol, and someone would actually physically stand up and yell, "We came here to talk about real drugs, not alcohol," and that's shifted, that's changed. But I think that whole debate about parental provision of alcohol is one that continues. I think the evidence is now quite clear in this country. And I do need to say in this country because there are certain cultures, certain parts of the world where the evidence is a little bit less definite, but certainly here, parental provision of alcohol does not protect. In fact, actually, when you provide alcohol to your child, they're more likely to drink more and there are more related harms. I always say to a parent, really, if you give your child 2 drinks to take to a party, they drink them quickly. Do you really believe that they're going to sit in a corner and play Scrabble for the rest of the night? They're going to go and look for 2 more. That's what we know with parental provision of alcohol, that instead of preventing further drinking, it actually encourages looking for more drinks afterwards. And that's a very hard message to give to parents. And after COVID and the restrictions and lockdowns and young people having their teenage life just ripped away from them for a couple of years, it takes a brave parent to stand up and say to their 16-year-old, "I am not giving you alcohol to take to a party."
So on that note, Paul, what impact has COVID had then on parental behaviour around parties and alcohol? Have you seen changes in trends at all?
Well, I've been on a couple of conference calls this morning just talking about that very thing. It doesn't matter where you go across the country, even in places like WA where they really weren't as affected by lockdowns, particularly through the past 2 years. Everywhere is seeing the same thing where, number one, young people have had a certain section of their teenage life, as I've said, taken away from them. They have now got freedom, in inverted commas, and they want to go out. They want to socialise with their friends, which is completely normal for teenagers to do. But some of them have had, this period of time where they most probably would have learned a few life skills about what they should do, what they shouldn't, had some experiences. Some of these kids have not had, Victorian kids particularly, 35 weeks of lockdown. So emotionally and in terms of their life experience, etc., they are, severely affected by this. And so parents are either overcompensating and going, well, I can't stop you. Go and do whatever you want because you deserve a good time, or absolutely terrified and trying to lock them down, which of course is not a good idea either.
This episode's topic is an area Collett is regularly asked about. One listener of the podcast sent us a message saying, "I've seen the issue of teens vaping all over the media lately. Do you have any advice for how I talk with my child about vaping or other drugs?" If you want to ask a question yourself, click the link in the show notes.
Paul, in terms of smoking, if we just change direction a little bit here, thinking back to when I was at school, there was actually a known smokers' corner in my high school. Down the back of the oval, someone would stand on lookout and wait for the teacher who was on playground duty to come and tell everyone, the teacher's coming, and cigarettes would be put out. What kind of happened was I feel like we also saw a trend in young people not smoking to the extent that they did in my generation. But there's so much talk now about young people and vaping, and I know schools are really struggling with this issue. I think about my own children. So my children range between 21 and 14, and certainly vaping was not even a thing on the radar when my 21-year-old was at school only a few short years ago. In fact, smoking trends were down for him and his mates. It wasn't kind of the cool thing when they were in high school. And yet reports from my son's generation and the teachers, particularly since COVID, I've seen reports of principals really struggling with controlling this in schools. And at the time of recording this, there was an article in the paper just a few days ago where a student was reported as having a seizure in a school bathroom due to nicotine overdose. So can you just give us a bit of a picture of what do we know about this area of vaping?
Well, my school actually had a smoking room for year 11s and year 12s. I mean,
Wow.
Yeah, if you're as old as I am.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
It was, yeah. They had it for a couple of years, but the whole issue around smoking and the success story that we've had around reducing smoking so dramatically is because we got the community behind it. The community saw it as something that hurt other people, not just the smokers. And as a result, we saw that downward trend. And certainly in schools, when I was a primary school teacher, we used to have to go around and walk around the bathrooms to check in primary school kids who were smoking. That has kind of almost been eliminated. And that is what I think is causing so much concern in schools, particularly around vaping, is that this is the first time since the very, very early 80s where we have seen a drug issue come back onto school grounds. Young people are not only vaping at school, but they're selling vapes at school. And schools have had to deal with this at the same time as dealing with COVID. You can't really disentangle those two things because these are things that you order online, they get delivered to your door. So even at the height of the pandemic in places like Melbourne and Sydney where we had major lockdowns, kids could still access these. I go to about 200 schools a year, speak to about 120,000 young people, and there is not a school in the country who are not struggling with this issue. It's something we don't know very much about because this is a very new phenomenon. The very first vape was invented in 2003. So when a 15-year-old contacts me and says, look, I'm vaping, what will it do to me in the future? I have to be really honest and say, I have absolutely no idea because they haven't even been around for 20 years. The great problem with this area, particularly for me as an educator, is that when you look at the research in any area, it can be contradictory. Well, with this one, it is mind-blowingly contradictory.
As a mental health professional, I put a great deal of trust in research because it's important for me to know what works. Unfortunately, though, not all research is equal. There can be political or financial reasons for some research being done, and it's really important to help your teen as you both look into where the research comes from and who funded it. As a start, have a conversation with your GP or an accredited health professional that you trust. Allow someone who has done the work to guide you.
There's two very, very, very active lobbies. There's a pro-vaping lobby and an anti-vaping lobby, and they fight very aggressively. And kids get stuck in the middle of it. And so you can't really give any powerful definites in this area about harms. And if you do, you can be shot down in flames very easily by a kid going online, Googling something and finding out, well, there's a piece of research that says that's not true. So that, I think, has caused lots of problems. I think one of the great issues in this area is that it's getting younger and younger. You talked about that story, which I saw in the paper as well. But I don't know how many parents saw, but down in Melbourne, they had a pre-primary child who was hospitalised. He got a vape from a year 2 and was vaping in a kindergarten bathroom and was found unconscious on the bathroom floor. I'm going to schools, being contacted by primary schools who have year 5s who are nicotine dependent. You know, we haven't seen that for a very long time. And the trouble is that back in the early 80s, we had services that were there for very young kids who were getting caught up in smoking. We don't have those services for young people and their families who are caught up in vaping.
If you are worried about any sort of drug addiction with your child, keep talking with them. work with them, and then go to your GP to ask for support. You can also go to Paul Dillon's website, and there are links in the show notes.
So at the moment, everyone is kind of struggling. Schools are working out, well, how do we stop these devices coming in, as well as trying to provide educational messages for those kids to prevent use. But where do you do prevention when you've got kindergarten kids who are messing around with it? What messages can we give people who are doing this about why they should stop? And also, where are the kind of referral pathways for those young people who are in trouble with it? So I just think the key for any parent around this area is to keep talking about it. Keep talking about it. Ask them about their friends and what their friends think. What do they think? Don't pass judgment. All those basic parenting things that you know better than anyone about. It applies to vaping more than anything else, I think, because it's about keeping connected, keeping communicating. Even if you don't know a lot, as I always say to parents, the key to any alcohol, the drug issue is if you don't know the answer, then you know what? You sit with your child and you learn together. If they believe something to be true because of something they've read, you believe something to be true because of something you've read, they don't match, then actually sit on a computer together and actually kind of work it through. It's about the best strategy we have in this area.
Yeah, and I think parents and schools can be quite fearful about vaping because the kids are the guinea pigs at the moment. We don't know what we're going to know in 20 years' time like we knew about smoking. I think you're right. Saying to children or your teenagers, I don't know all the answers about this, but let's start looking at the research. Let's start figuring out together and see what comes up. So yeah, that's good advice, Paul.
So often a child says to you, when you say, I don't want you to do this or whatever, a child will go, oh, you don't know what it's like. Well,
Yes.
The best part about this is that you as a parent could turn around and go, that's absolutely true. This was not around when I was at school, so I don't know anything about it. I want you to tell me. What's the attraction? Why do you want to do this? Secondly, what effect do you get out of it? All those kind of things. You can really have a quality conversation here. There are parents who are losing their kids over this vaping issue. They're losing connection with their kids. And as I said to one mum who contacted me just a couple of days ago, I wrote back and I had like 3 emails in a row from this mum just going on about all these issues with her daughter. And the one she was focusing on was vaping. Like, I need to know what she's vaping, all this kind of stuff. And I wrote back and I said, you sound like you've got so many problems here. Is it really worth losing your daughter over the fact that she's vaping? Let's actually remove everything else and then come back to the vaping thing, because it's so easy to tag it on to, I've got problems with my adolescent daughter because of vaping, whereas actually she's an adolescent. There's a whole pile of problems anyway.
Yeah, there's other things that ought to be looked at first.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, good point. So, Paul, then in terms of drugs in general, can you chat with us a little bit about the current situation in Australia? Has the way young people access drugs in Australia changed in recent years?
The real problem in this area, Collett, is that we know so much about illicit drug sort of situation in Australia because we've got great data collection instruments, and that is still true. The trouble is that COVID has halted that. We have the most fantastic school survey called the ASAD survey, the Australian Secondary School Alcohol and Drug Survey. Gets conducted every couple of years, and it gives us a great snapshot of what's happening across the country with school-based young people. Unfortunately, the last one was collected in 2017. We were having the 2020 data being collected, and then COVID hit. So we're now having the 2022 data collected. It hopefully will come out by the end of the year, but that's a 5-year gap. I've been in this area for a long time, and we've never had that long a gap. So I think a lot has happened in that time for a number of different reasons. I think the main one being is that so much alcohol and other drug use is associated with socializing. And of course, socializing has been severely impacted for a number of years. So has that changed? And have we moved on to drugs that are more easily accessible and more likely to be used in isolation? Certainly the anecdotal evidence would say that most young people are accessing vapes through friendship networks, but particularly through social media, Snapchat, Instagram, things like that. If a child wants access to anything, it is literally a couple of clicks away. It is so easy for them to access if they want them. And the beauty of what we do know about Australian young people, unless it's changed dramatically, and I don't think it really has, is the vast majority of our school-based young people are not interested in illicit drugs. That changes dramatically once they leave school. For a whole pile of reasons, we see drug use jump. But, I had 3 girls at a school at the beginning of last year. I gave my talk on vaping, and these 3 year 11 girls came up and said, do you want to see how easy it is to buy a vape? They got their phone out, they opened Snapchat, they did #vape, and and I didn't time it, but it was very most 5 minutes, they had managed to find someone who agreed to sell them 50 vapes, meet them at the local train station to hand them over, and they were going to give them $3 for every vape they on-sold. So essentially making drug dealers of very young people. I then was in Perth not long after, and a young man showed me how easy he could buy ecstasy or MDMA. He went onto an app which is called Telegram. I timed him. It took him 3.5 minutes from the minute he opened the app to pushing the final button, which would have meant he confirmed the deal, which he didn't do. 3.5 minutes to purchase 50 MDMA caps to be delivered to the gate of the school at 3:15. 3.5 minutes.
My goodness. So that says a lot again about parents being aware of what their children are doing online, their young teens particularly, what they're doing on social media, doing check-ins on what they're doing, being aware of what your children are spending their money on so that you can have those conversations then, I think, Paul.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the great problem with the social media thing is I've given enough talks and heard people who know far more about social media than I do talk about the fact you should monitor your kids as much as possible. Reality is kids are 100 miles in front of us on everything around technology. We should never beat up parents about you don't do it enough. You do what you can. But I loved your second one because that is the one thing about monitoring their money, which whenever I say that at a parent night, you can literally see a collective, you can almost see them shudder because parents do not want to do that. And when you ever say to a parent, why don't you want to monitor their money? And they say, but that, that's their privacy. And I think they're 15, for heaven's sake.
Yeah. Monitoring is such a loaded topic. It's not something that I found easy as a parent, but it's so important. Monitoring and boundaries with our young teens is all part of loving them and keeping them safe in some areas of their lives. I mean, when we had toddlers, we put up pool fences because they couldn't swim yet. And then further down the track, we'd give them the key to the pool fence as they became stronger swimmers. It's the same in so many areas of our teen lives. For example, checking what our teens are spending their money on can also be done in a way that teaches them about budgeting and saving and builds good life skills.
Some of these kids, if they're working, at McDonald's or whatever, the actual amount of money they get is a reasonable amount of money. If you do not know where every penny of that's going and you can't see anything for that money, if they are getting $200 a week and you do not see $200 worth of goods as a result of it.
Goods or savings.
Yeah, exactly. Then you have to start asking questions because the reality is alcohol and other drugs cost money. I don't think you should reduce their access to their money, but certainly you should monitor it. The evidence is very clear around monitoring money. If you want to reduce the use of illicit drugs, it's not so much with alcohol, but certainly with illicit drugs, monitor their money.
Yeah, thank you. If there's a parent listening who suspects that their teen is experimenting with drugs or binge drinking, what advice do you give them about conversations about where to from here?
Look, I think if you're just going to all of a sudden have a conversation as a result of believing something has happened, then you're miles behind the 8 ball anyway. I think this should be an ongoing conversation that starts when it comes to alcohol and other drugs. The minute you start giving your kids drugs, you should start talking about them. And the reality is that we live in a drug-taking society where goodness me, we have baby Nurofen, for heaven's sake, now. We're giving very, very young children drugs, and yet how often does a parent, when they give their child a Panadol or something, do they actually look at the box and read the instructions and say, let's have a talk about how we deliver medicines? I don't know about you, Collett, but when we used to go to a doctor, the doctor used to actually tell us when they did a prescription about the actual drug and how you should take it. And it was a pretty long discussion about that. Then you go to the chemist, you get
all the side effects.
You get the same kind of discussion when you went to the chemist. Now, the Medicare 15-minute consultation, you're out. You just get a script. And if you don't get a script, then you're very disappointed because, I went to the doctors to get medicine. So all of those conversations about the risks associated with medications and stuff, parents have to bring those back. And if you keep having those conversations, then all this other stuff just actually happens a lot more naturally. The evidence is very clear in what kind of conversations work around alcohol particularly. And it's not just what you say, it's when you say it, where you say it, and how you say it. Realistically, we know that reactive conversations are far less effective than proactive ones. So getting in before and having those discussions, but they shouldn't be a sit-down formal chat. It's much more about finding those opportunities to raise issues. And unfortunately, you do get parents who the first time they have a conversation is sadly when something goes wrong. And those conversations are not going to work as well. And
so it's using opportunities like something you might see in a movie you're watching or something advertised on TV or day-to-day stuff. It's in the relationship again. It's always about relationship.
Yeah. One of the key things is if anyone's ever seen me speak to a young person, I never, ever, ever talk about what will happen to you if you drink. I never talk what will happen to you if you use cannabis or whatever. I talk about their friends because the evidence shows quite clearly that when you make statements to young people because of where they are in their life, kids are aware of dangers. I mean, the first group of kids I speak to are year 10s. There's not one year 10 that I speak to who doesn't know that if you drink too much, bad things will happen. But the reality is if I go on about when you drink this much, this will happen, they tune out. But when I say, how do you look after a drunk friend? They tune in completely because it's not about them. And one of the great little tricks that I always say to parents works really well is don't ask about their opinion on something.
Yep.
Think about someone that they really look up to or something and say, what does Jane think about this? What does Jane think about vaping? Has she ever talked to you about vaping?
Whoa, hang on. That is a great point. This is a technique to use anywhere in your journey as a parent. I say in my seminars all the time that when you want to talk about a tricky topic, ask your teen what their friends are doing or what their friends might think about an issue, and try to do it in a curious tone rather than some sit-down interrogation.
Talking about a friend's use is not so confrontational as talking about their own values. Now, if they are keen to share their values, go for it. That's great. But most young people aren't with their parents. They're more than happy to talk about their friends.
Yeah, it breaks down the barriers. To finish off, despite everything that you do in this whole area of drugs and alcohol, I have always found your work incredibly hope-filled. You've mentioned, and I know that you go around to schools and you talk to teens about these topics all the time. And what is the response from teens to you that gives you hope for them?
I don't think I've ever had a year quite like this one, where I was speaking to, a room full of teenagers all wearing masks. I was in Tasmania yesterday where that's still happening. When I go to Melbourne, I never get through a day without having a tear in my eye, looking at those kids and thinking what they've been through. And yet they still smile. I've got an Instagram page where I have like 34,000 teenagers who follow me on Instagram, and they send me photographs of themselves following the tips and strategies that I give to them in my talks. I think we read so many bad things about kids and that this generation of young people are worse than in the past. And I think older people love to hear that because it makes us feel less guilty about what we did. But our kids are incredible. And I think the more we lift them up and celebrate them, instead of kind of knocking them down and saying how bad they are, which is what, some branches of the media love to do, I think we should be highlighting all the fantastic things they do. To have, a couple of years of their teenage life wrenched from them, and yet they can still smile. I think that's unbelievable. I've been working with young people for a very long time now, and I don't think you could beat our current generation of young people.
The way our teens think about alcohol and drugs is quite different to previous generations. I just loved Paul's advice about being proactive rather than reactive on this topic. So chatting about it when they are young and making it a natural conversation rather than something big and scary. If you would like to know more about Paul's work, you can find him at data.net.au. That is DARTA.net.au. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode at raisingteenagers.com.au or via the Raising Teens page at hopepodcast.com.au. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, video edited by Christian Valenzuela, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.